Welcome to Perpetual Motion, the podcast designed to help my fellow intellectual tourists master communication, accelerate your career, and level up your love life. I'm Dr. Mo Anderson, TEDx speaker, best-selling author, and your guide on this journey to the bigger opportunities and better relationships that await. Today, we're honored to have Paolo Gaudiano join us. Paolo is a distinguished author, entrepreneur, TEDx speaker, and thought leader in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI. He is the author of Measuring Inclusion, Higher Profits, and Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash. We're going to take a deep dive into this currently controversial topic as we explore the measurable benefits of DEI initiatives. Stay tuned. Welcome, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mo. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And like I said, this is a hot topic right now, one near and dear to me as an African American who has lectured about this, promoted it, and never dreamed that there would be this level of controversy around it, honestly. As for you, someone who doesn't fit the stereotypical demographic of DEI advocates, and I'm saying that because not everyone will be watching the video. For those listening to audio, you're a white guy. And I've done half a dozen interviews about DEI, and it's always been a person of color. So I'm desperate to hear your perspective, and I'm really, really glad. I know you don't use the term ally, but I'm really, really glad you are on this side of the equation. So let's just jump right in. As someone, again, who doesn't fit the stereotypical demographic of DEI advocates, please share what inspired your transition from aerospace engineering and neuroscience to focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. And I do actually like to begin every presentation that I do by addressing what I jokingly call the white elephant in the room, and that's me. As you said, I'm white, male, cisgender, heterosexual. I got like all the privilege in the world. I was born and raised in Italy, so technically I'm an immigrant. In practice, what it means is that I get to split my time between New York and Rome. So, poor me, privilege
You poor
sucks.
thing. I hate that for you.
I know, it's terrible. And the way that I got into the space is a little bit unusual because as you pointed out, so my undergraduate degree was in applied mathematics, but toward the end of that, I was both really interested in engineering, but also really interested in how the brain works. I learned about that kind of late in my undergraduate. And I ended up finding a master's degree in aerospace engineering, where we literally did some project on things like sending experiments up on the space shuttle and understanding how rockets work. But I also studied a lot of neuroscience. And eventually my PhD was in an area called computational neuroscience. Mm-hmm. And really, that was the genesis of a lot of the work that I'm doing now in a weird way, which is that I was trying to understand, and not just me, but my colleagues, how do you take neurons that by themselves are very simple, very squishy objects, and somehow when you put them together, you can do things like see and speak. And if you're Italian like me, you moved your hands a lot, right? How is that possible? And so I did that by taking this unique analytical approach that shows how you can connect the behaviors of individual neurons when you put them in a big circuit and use computer simulations to help you understand what happens at the macroscopic level. And then years later, so I was a professor for about 10 years. I applied those ideas to study robots, but also I did a lot of actual neuroscience, working with a variety of fields in memory and learning, in vision, and things of that sort. And then eventually, after 10 years in academia, I left my tenure position to become an entrepreneur. And I joined forces with a friend of mine that has started a company where we used a similar idea, but now instead of looking at how neurons come together to give us the kinds of sensory capabilities that we have, we looked at how people come together to do amazing things that individuals cannot do. So whether you're talking about people in a company or consumers in a marketplace or soldiers on a battlefield or whatever, users on a computer network that are sharing information, we built these computer simulations to help primarily large corporations, but also foundations and government agencies figure out how to solve really complex problems that were primarily about business and occasionally about society. And then it was about 10 years ago. So after doing that for 15 years, 10 years ago, so it tells you how old I am. If you do the math, 10 years as a professor, 15 years as a consultant entrepreneurs, and now 10 years in DEI. But so 10 years ago, I had this light bulb moment when I was sitting in the umpteenth, session on DEI. I was always interested personally but I thought, I'm a white dude. What can I possibly do, right? I'm not an activist kind of guy. And I would always go to these sessions on, how do you get more women into leadership roles? How do you get more Black people into these kinds of fields? And I was always struck by the contrast between the specific things that people describe that happen to them because of their race, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, because of their disabilities. And when it came to solutions, it was these very general things, like, oh, we need to remove systemic barriers. We need to change the hearts and minds of corporate America. And one day, literally in 2015, I was sitting there contemplating this and thinking, how do you connect those two? And the light bulb went off, and I thought, well, wait a second, this is what I've been doing my entire career. First, studying the brain, and then studying society. And maybe I can use my methodology to find a way to quantify the financial impact that companies will have as a result of how they treat their employees.
Right.
And we'd already done a lot of organizational management problems. And I thought, well, if I start to take into account the actual experiences that people have in the workplace and how those differ depending on their personal identity traits, then I might be able to argue that there is a motivation beyond just doing the right thing and actually showing a financial motive. Because I firmly believe, and I'm sure you will agree with me, most forms of discrimination, segregation, racism, many of them are ultimately founded on economic motives that are often kind of concealed under other kinds of things that people use to foment hatred and separation and polarization. But the reality is that a lot of that is driven by really economic motives. And so I thought, as long as people are arguing for DEI on the basis of fairness, justice, etc., it's always going to be a losing battle. But if we can convince leaders that they can make more money by treating people better, then I think that there is a chance to do that. And so 10 years ago, I had this idea. I got super excited. I stopped everything else I was doing. I built these computer simulations that actually proved to me that the way that you treat people in the organization has an impact not only on the diversity of the organization, but on the financial performance of the organization. Absolutely. And so after that, I started a small research nonprofit. I started a small research center in an academic institution. And then I started Alderia, which is a for-profit that really focuses on helping companies quantify the impact of DEI in a way that completely avoids the guesswork and the backlash, as the title of my book indicates.
Absolutely. And we're going to get into that as well. I had so many thoughts. There's a lot to unpack there. And thank you so much for sharing that part of your journey. You've just given a whole new meaning to the term applied science. And we know that corporations are driven by that triple, quadruple bottom line, primarily the financial impact. I've seen a lot of research around how the decision making is better when you have a diverse group and it's collaborative, but I'm looking forward to hearing how also it impacts the financial bottom line of organizations. And I just have to say this, which is not related, but you were a professor for a decade, and I hope your students had some way of recording you were speaking, because I was just thinking, oh my goodness, if I were trying to take notes, I would be jacked up, because the way my southern neurons all come together is slowly but surely. So
yeah,
I love
no,
that.
you're absolutely right. And I have to say, I was always very careful about preparing slides in advance and making sure that I share the slides with students. And I always told them, if you want to take notes, go ahead. But I speak very fast and I throw a lot of material in a very short time. And so people found that, having notes really helps, or recording something really helps as well.
Yeah. Well, we're absolutely recording this for perpetuity, evergreen. And of course, we have the option of captions as well. Not trying to change your way of speaking, but I just got that other little sense of humor that I have to
I appreciate
bring
that.
out sometimes.
I appreciate that.
So we understand how you got here. Kudos to you for leaving a tenured position. That's like leaving the Supreme Court. Very few people do that in history, but you left to do something really great, and you're using all of that knowledge. So I love it. I'm interested in your personal background, whether it's being, what is that, transatlantic? I suck at geography. Yes, transatlantic, and I love Rome. How has your personal background influenced your perspectives and approaches in this field? As you said, you're not the typical person, promoting D.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that there is a lot of general agreement that people that are exposed to multiple cultures, especially from a young age, tend to be more open-minded. And I certainly, my parents did a lot of traveling, kind of unusual levels of traveling for being a traditional Italian family. And so that always exposed me from a young age to different cultures, being in places where people did not look like me, where people spoke a different language. And then when we came to the United States, I was actually a teenager, and we came twice, actually. The first time I was 13 and we only stayed for a few months. My father was a visiting professor in chemistry at UC Santa Barbara. And in the summertime, that was actually my very first exposure to racial tensions in the United States. And the way that it happened was kind of interesting. I was 13 years old. We lived in this apartment building in Goleta, California, kind of a very fun student town. My brothers and I had made friends with two kids that were one of them was roughly my age and the other one was younger, was my brother's ages. I spoke like 20 words of English. I'd not studied English. I had studied French in school. So for me, it was a new language. I'd been there for a few weeks. I was picking up a little bit on the street and I was friends with this kid. We would play. And then one day he turns to me and he says, he looks at me and he says, "Do you think I'm a Negro?" And I was like, I thought maybe I misunderstood. At the time in Italy, first of all, there were very few black people, but the only word that we had for black people was negro, which is basically like the color black.
Right.
And so when he asked me again, I was like, yes. And then he started hitting me.
What year is this, Paolo?
This was, so this would have been 1975.
Okay.
So we're talking about a long time ago. We're talking about 50 years ago, literally 50 years ago. And so he started hitting me and I was like, what the hell is going on? So I ran home and I explained it to my parents, and my parents, who had been in the States before and understood some of these issues, they went to talk to his parents, but he refused to ever speak with me again. And I remember thinking, this is so weird, and then later in life, as I kind of looked at it retrospectively and realized that, this was an interesting situation in which there was a very uncomfortable situation. Now, for me, I had no idea what was going on. And it was kind of a weird one-time experience that made me feel kind of weird. But then I realized later, it's like for this kid, it was like his entire life, every single day, every part of his life. And as I, especially once I got into DI, I'm now honored to be friends and collaborator with so many people who identify as people of color, African-American, but also people from a number of different cultures. And I appreciate just how incredibly difficult it is for people who do not have all the privileges that I have to go on even with like the simplest things in life. And that's something that I find really devastating. And it's given me a lot more energy and motivation in the work that I'm doing. And by the way, as you pointed out, I don't really like the term ally, because to me, calling a white man an ally is like saying, oh, somebody comes into my house and is robbing me blind. On the way out, they knock something over and they stop to pick it up and they say, oh, thank you for being an ally. It's like, let's be real. I mean, ultimately, to me, I see that there's a couple of reasons why I feel that there is a more than just being an ally. To me, one thing that's really important is that I can get into rooms and talk to people who look like me, who will listen to me in a very, very different way that they would listen to you. And there's something about, we're a tribe, just like any other tribe. And
as a male as well, not
absolutely.
just
as a white, and you're exactly right. And I should be more careful about that. So being privileged along all of those dimensions, I can get into a room of CEOs who typically tend to be white men, but not always. And, oh, look, this guy's a former professor and he's written a book and he's gotten the TED Talk and all these other things. And they would listen to me in a way that you could take my exact words, my book, and put it in your name, and they would not listen to you in the same way. And so to me, I feel like I have a really, really important responsibility. I see what some of the problems are. I have tools that can help to overcome them. But more importantly, I act as a bit of a buffer between two parts of the population, which sadly, I wish that there were not two parts of the population, but they are. And I'm very fortunate to be able to kind of keep a foot in both communities and understand how I can kind of translate between one and the other. And for what it's worth, especially in the last several years, I'm often finding myself doing the reverse, which is I think there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding among communities of color, people with disabilities, about what really goes on in the heads of white people. And I think that there's a lot of this misunderstanding, and a lot of problems have arisen because of these mutual misunderstandings. And so I find myself
we'll have to have you back, because that's a really good topic. What really goes on in the heads of white people? I'm right now asking you to come back and do an episode.
Part two. We'll talk about some of the misunderstandings.
That'll be my most downloaded episode in history, because there's a lot of conjecture around that.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm a very, I find that if you're candid and you're honest, look, sometimes I've said stupid things that people would have had every right to get upset at me about it. But in general, it's like, look, if I make a mistake, tell me. And I'm going to treat you the same way, which sometimes I've been told that sometimes my direct approach can be a little bit off-putting to people that are not quite used to that. But it's like, look, if you say something that I think is wrong or stupid or that it's actually harmful, I'll tell you about it and I'll try to explain to you why. And if I'm wrong, I will more than gladly change my mind. But if I'm right, I'm doing it not because I want to criticize you, it's because I want to try to help you improve in, be more successful at what you're trying to do. And so I have some amazing conversations. Right now, I'm writing a second book with a dear, dear friend of mine that is a Black woman, and we have the most amazing conversations. In fact, we're thinking about starting our own podcast where it's like the two of us
Well, that would
showing
be
what it's
great.
like.
Congratulations.
Thank you. No, but so I'm very excited to be your guest, and I would love to come back more. Whatever. Happy to have as
I'm
many
happy to
conversations
have
as
you
you
here. And
want.
when your podcast starts, I'd love for you to have me on as well, and we can
Absolutely.
continue this conversation. What I love about what you said is that you recognize your position of privilege, even though people hate that word. That's what it is. It's a leg up. But you're confident in who you are and in what you're doing, and you say it with that unapologetically. And I like that because I think that's part of the backlash is people think that when we say, okay, you've got your privilege, that we're accusing them or something, or that it's a negative thing. It's just a fact. It's
Yeah,
just a fact.
absolutely.
And I can say that because I am a poster child for isms. I have cancer. I'm a female. I'm African American, and even my Southern dialect, people sometimes confuse with my intellect. This is just the way I learned to speak. It's slower, but it's not, less than. But there are so many ways people find to try to separate themselves from all the great things we have in common. And it does hurt. And like you said, I have 8 books, I have a TEDx talk, done speaking all over the world. But if someone was going to pick one of us, both of us, most corporations, and I'm going to say males in particular, because I do speak to groups, but the majority of my invitations, I just had a light bulb moment. The majority of my invitations come from females. So of all races, but from females. So there is something about some people who just don't see the value that I bring because I don't look like them. And that's
Absolutely.
unfortunate for them.
Absolutely. No, and I look, part of the work that we do is that we get people to share experiences of things that happen to them. And as you were speaking about some of the, your identities, your intersectional identity, what comes to mind is like the comments that we hear, people that are saying things like, oh, somebody came to me and said, oh, you sound so smart. You're so eloquent. And, I remember the first time that I heard something like that, I was like, well, what's wrong with that? And then it's like, I understand exactly what's wrong with that. It's like, you look stupid, you sound stupid. And it's surprising to me that you're actually able to put a sentence together and say something intelligent. And it's really, and that's why I was saying a lot about the misunderstandings. A lot of times when white people don't understand that, it's not because they're evil or insensitive. It's just because if you don't experience something,
right,
you don't have a frame of reference. And so if somebody comes to you and says, oh, I've actually had positive, constructive discussions with men who I witnessed making comments that were inappropriate especially toward women, in which their response was like, oh, come on, don't be so sensitive. And then it was like, listen, let me explain something to you. If that kind of crap happened to you day in and day out in your life, in every facet of what you do, you'd be pretty damn sensitive about it too. And I'm pretty sure that there are things that really annoy you too. But again, until we have blinders on, we see what we only know what we've experienced. And so, I mean, that's the kind of example. So like when you were talking about your identity, to me now, it means something very, very, very crisp and clear. 10 years ago, even though I was your well-intentioned white guy, I would have had no clue. And,
right,
and it takes work and it takes effort. And I appreciate people that are willing to make that effort. And I try to
right, and
speak
do
to
the
a lot
work.
of them as well. So
Right, right.
anyway, sorry, we're kind of going off on tangents here,
Yes,
but
okay. That's what we do here. Perpetual motion. That's the
exactly.
name. We reserve the right to twirl this way, twirl that way. It's an unusual way to orbit, but it works for us. So we're already there, but let's dive deeper into the hot topic. There has been notable high-level backlash against DEI initiative in various sectors in the United States in particular. 2 questions, Paolo. First, what is their freaking problem? I'm just not clear. Is it fear? Is it history? Is it greed? And second, how can organizations and individuals like myself address such resistance effectively and be heard?
Yeah. So this might take another episode number 3 to get through all of these
Okay.
points.
Well,
But
give us the Cliff Notes
okay,
version
so
of it.
cliff notes. First of all, I think that DEI has become a bit of a red herring in the sense that I firmly believe that the people that have been so vocal against DEI, including our esteemed leaders in the government, in part are doing that as a distraction tactic, because they're going around destroying democracy, dismantling the government, and they talk about like, oh, we're going to stop all illegal DI activities. So what are we going to do for that? We're going to fire half of the government employees. I mean, come on, it's like Let's be honest about what we're actually doing here. Now, so that's, to me, there is a motive that a lot of times I think people do not appreciate. I think that they're not, there are definitely a bunch of really profoundly racist people of the kind who believe that it is in their best interest to continue to oppress and take advantage of other groups of people. There are people like that.
Wow,
However,
you said
I think,
profoundly racist.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. But there is a very interesting point that I wrote about it recently. I think what's happened a lot, and I want to, I hate to say I told you so, but in this case, I've been telling people I told you so a lot. I wrote an article in 2018 in Forbes in which I said, I've been spending about 3 years in the space. And based on the work that I was doing, I saw a fundamental problem with the way that DI was being approached. And I wrote an article in which I said, if companies continue to focus on diversity alone as the only metric of progress and the only yardstick and for targets, you're going to see backlash. You're going to see backlash from white men complaining to their employers about reverse discrimination, and it will spread to other parts of society like affirmative action. I wrote this on April 2nd of 2018, 2 years, 1 month, 23 days before the murder of George Floyd. How the hell did I know that? Now, here's what happened. We in the DEI space, and I like to consider myself, I've been working in this space for 10 years, so it's my career now, right? There have been a couple of mistakes. One of them is this focus on diversity alone, and I'm happy to come back on that. But the problem is that diversity is an outcome. I like to joke with people, if I walk into a room in the winter or in my house in the winter and I feel cold, I look at the thermostat, it reads 50 degrees. How do I fix it? I light a match under the thermostat. And now look, it's reached 70, 80, 90 degrees. But meanwhile, the windows are drafty, the front door is open, the roof is leaking, and I might burn the house down. And that's exactly what we did. We're trying to fix the thermostat. We're trying to fix the diversity because we see that there is low diversity. That's been one problem. Diversity is the outcome. And as I say in my book, inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get. And my science demonstrates that very clearly. The way that you treat people will influence your diversity, because if people don't like the way they're treated, they will leave. If you don't have enough Black people in your company, it's not because you're not hiring enough of them. I mean, that contributes to it, but a much bigger factor is that you're losing a lot of them. And you see in every company, the retention rates of people of color, of women, of people with disabilities is way lower than it is for white men. So if you simply fix the retention, the inclusion, if you will, that would fix that. That's the first problem. The second problem, and I apologize for this long-winded answer, is that we have left the doors wide open by creating terms that we all understand what they mean, but we never really bothered to explain them very well. So you go to 10 DEI experts. And by the way, I've done this exercise by pulling down all the books off my shelves and looking for definitions of inclusion. You're going to get 10 different definitions. And so when I hear people say, oh, these critics of DEI, they describe it as an ideology, they don't understand what true DEI is. Well, my challenge is, you tell me what true DEI is. Because you know what? I've yet to hear an actual definition that is very clear. So what happens is that we have these vague definitions where we all get it, but we have a hard time putting into words. What that did is that it left the door wide open for people to come back and say, DI is an ideology. DI is a bureaucracy. DI is discrimination against white people. So when you are the middle of the population that has no idea what DI really is, and they're kind of agnostic about it, and then you hear about your cousin's brother-in-law, second time removed, who happened to have not been promoted because they told him that they were going to promote a Black person before they promoted him, all of a sudden you feel like, oh my God, we poor white people are being discriminated against. And when the government tells you that's what's happening, then all of a sudden to you, DI means something that it is not. But unfortunately, we have left ourselves completely vulnerable to those kinds of attacks. And these people have pounced on it. They've made a disastrous situation by taking advantage of some of the weak points. And that's, I think, dreadful. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer, but like I said,
No,
it's not an easy problem. It's not as simple as saying, oh, there's a bunch of racist pigs out there. I actually think the number of racist pigs, there are really horrible, profoundly racist people. That number, I believe, is smaller than a lot of DI people think, but it's just that we have inadvertently helped to create an environment in which those people could use old book. This is like an old trick, right? Driving a wedge between white people and Black people has been a trick for a long time. Jim Crow, and before that, and after that, civil rights. But it's always been, look at what Nixon did, right? Republicans use that as a way to drive a wedge between people. We're seeing that same trick playing out right now in a slightly different way, but it's the same problem.
Right. And I'm going to say it's a wedge that is excluding a larger group than Black people, because now we've got Latino people being shipped off to God knows where for without due process. We've got just this last week, I believe there were 2 high-level females in the military who were fired from their positions because they believe in diversity. I mean, you can't even use these words anymore. It's just ridiculous. Who doesn't believe in diversity? And when I encounter males who have an issue with it, they always have daughters. And I'm like, you do realize that you're pushing back between your daughter having an opportunity for a career and to rise. It's not just a black and white thing, which is what so
Oh,
many
agreed.
people think
Agreed.
until they feel the impact,
Yeah.
particularly of these recent
Yeah.
orders and destruction of programs that have been very, very effective. So your idea of using or your method of using evidence-based research to come up with strategies and to measure outcomes really has to be the way to go because it's hard for most people to argue with facts, even though we're getting away from believing science as well. It is a minority of people, I believe. I've seen the changes. I was, came in on the cusp of the civil rights movement. So I remember seeing Klan marches as a kid in downtown and just being terrified by it as I clung to my mother's hand. Now I'm seeing them again as a grandmother, and I'm like, what the hell? This is not the full circle I anticipated.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is
No,
this
it's
is not
terrible.
it.
It's terrible.
It
Yeah, and as you
is.
pointed out, yeah, it's all entities, like the transgender, they're turning everybody against everybody else. So
Yes,
they're targeting transgender community, LGBTQ. I mean, they're all everybody's just getting completely devastated, and it's disturbing is a very light way to put it. It's really, really just horrible what is happening.
absolutely, absolutely. You talked about a bit about your book, Measuring Inclusion, and the importance of measuring inclusion over diversity. It occurs to me, I don't think I like the level set. I like for everyone to be on the same page. I don't think we've actually defined or how you would define those terms, D, E, and I. Would you do that for
Yeah,
me and also explain why it's important to measure inclusion over diversity? I like compound questions, but you're a brilliant guy. You got me.
I'll see if I can. I'll see if I'm not as dumb as I look. No, I'm just kidding.
You said that, folks. He
I know,
said
I know.
that.
I'm just kidding.
And he doesn't look dumb at all. Even his office looks smart. It's like smart stuff on the wall, not like me with pictures of myself. So
Oh, no, I mean, well, I think your background looks better than mine, but that's I always forget to erase my blackboard and then
I
whatever's up
love
there.
it.
But
Leave it. I love it.
no, but so in my book, I give what I like to think are very simple, clear definitions. They do require a bit of explanation, but what I say is that inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, equity is what you want. And the way that I came to that was recognizing that. And by the way, I want to be careful about something. I'm not suggesting that you should measure inclusion over diversity. You need both.
Okay.
But to me, and one of the things I'm careful about, first of all, when we talk about inclusion, not only do you get a lot of definitions, but some people talk about inclusion as the feeling of individuals. Some people talk about inclusion as how the company behaves. Some people talk about inclusion as being part of the culture. Those are very, very, very different things. So one of
Yes.
the things that I'm very careful about is that I am interested in understanding things from the point of view of the company. So when I say inclusion is what you do, what I mean is the following. If you allow conditions to exist in your company that lead to one group of people having a different set of experiences and different level of satisfaction than another, then you're not being inclusive.
Mm.
So to me, inclusion is really about, are women less satisfied in their job than men? If they are, it means that you're doing something that is creating these differences, means you're not being inclusive. So inclusion is what you do as a company. Diversity is what you get. Well, I've already hinted at that before. And my science, like building these computer simulations, I can literally show you how if you have a company in which one group of people is treated better than the other, what will happen is that the other group, I'm sorry, the one that's treated better will have higher representation. So you will have less diversity because the group, so if you start with 50-50, but you make it harder for one group to advance than the other, then what you're going to see is that you're going to see that the group that is privileged will advance and will have more and more people, exactly like we see in real companies. By the way, there is an interesting corollary that turns out that, and I've literally written a paper in which I prove that if that happens, you have another effect, which is that the people from the underprivileged group that advance, on average, are more talented. So I've literally written a paper in which I said, here is quantitative proof that Black women are better than white men. So in the corporate world, right? That's seriously, like I can show you, I did that on Forbes. So inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get. Now, why do I say that equity is what you want? Well, because, and again, people define equity. You've seen those pictures about the kids watching the baseball game behind the
Right on
fence,
the
or the kids
fence. Yeah.
picking apples from the trees. And my answer is like, why are we focusing on those ideas? If I own the baseball stadium, I want to know why the hell these kids are stealing my game, and why should I put crates under them so they can all watch the game for free? If I have an apple orchard, why do I want kids taking my apples away from me? And I'm going to put ladders under them so they can steal my apples more successfully, right? It's like sometimes we don't think about what are we trying to who are we trying to convince here? We're just trying to
Right.
talk to
The other
ourselves.
side.
So
Yeah.
why does a company want equity? The reason why is because the same women, people of color, people with disabilities that are less satisfied and are more likely to leave are also producing less, which means that if I have the same, let's just take a very simple example, 50% men, 50% women. The men have a very high level of satisfaction. The women's satisfaction is lower. Those women will produce less, which means that you're making less money top line. And they're going to be more likely to leave, which means that you have to pay more money to rehire employees that are left voluntarily. And I have built a calculator that can literally show a company how much money they're losing if they're not being inclusive. And you would measure this inequity. So an inequity would be a difference in the satisfaction of these people. So if you find an inequity, it's costing you money, which means that you want to eliminate that inequity. So equity is what you want,
Right.
which, by the way, gives you a much more elegant target than 13% of these, 28% of those, 5% of these. It says, look for inequities in your company and drive them to zero. And if you do that, you will have a more inclusive organization, a more diverse organization, and a company that is making more money.
Great. Great. You
Sounds
just
pretty simple to me, right? It sounds pretty obvious.
That's the business case for inclusion.
But
That's
it's the
it.
business case for a specific company. Like I literally go to a company and say, this is how much money you're losing today. And by the way, it's a lot of money. We estimate that a typical company loses between 20 and 30% of their net profits
Right.
to
Right.
low levels of inclusion. That's big money. That's millions of dollars for a medium-sized company. So
Right. Right.
yeah.
Citigroup did a really great analysis of that a few years ago as well. But, my struggle is so often the people who are listening and paying attention are not the people who need the message the most. So I am just hopeful that those who can, get in the room, get at the table, whatever we want to call it, are willing to, like you, be advocates and share the message, people who they're more likely to listen to until we all have equal opportunity to speak and be heard. And actually, I just took a note as we were talking, which I don't do a lot, but it just occurred to me, I'm not certain if my company, with those constant surveys that they're doing, if they're looking at it on the basis of gender and not just on the basis of a department or a manager. Are we measuring in that way? Because that could show something very, very significant that's getting lost in the aggregate. So I really, really like the points that you're making.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's talk about your TED Talk, which has a wonderful, wonderful title, What DEI Gets Wrong and How to Do It Right. And you mentioned that many companies approach DEI incorrectly, which you've addressed some here in your previous comments. But what are some other common mistakes organizations make, and how can they rectify them?
Well, so I lots of ideas and examples, but in that TED Talk, which, by the way, there was an interesting story, which is that I gave the TED Talk in November of 23 in Harlem, at TEDx Harlem. And the title was slightly different. And then what happened is that the TED organization saw it and they reached out to me in early 2024 and they said, we love your talk. Can we rebrand it as a TED Talk and give it a different title and put it on our main site? Which is wonderful for me because now I have like 300,000 views, which is pretty nice. And I bet a lot of those views are people who look like me, which is exactly the audience that I'm trying to reach. But basically, and again, to be very candid, I talked in that TED Talk about both the kinds of mistakes that have been made, both in terms of not treating people properly, but also of trying to do DEI in a way that even with the best of intentions was not particularly successful and created this kind of backlash. And so I talk about some of the ideas, again, of not focusing only on diversity, but understanding why you need to think about inclusion. And then I talk about the fact that in many situations, instead of focusing on diversity or on, I should say, on identity first, focusing on inclusion has a kind of unexpected benefit, which is that you're avoiding this fragmentation of saying, oh, should I put money into a pride parade? Should I build new ramps for people within a wheelchair? Should I do, Black History Month event, whatever the case might be, which you always feel like you're leaving somebody out. And instead, one of the things that I point out is that if you focus on bucketing problems instead of bucketing people, you are going to automatically benefit most the people who have been the most excluded. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's say typical example, when we measure inclusion, we do a workshop to kind of expose people to these different ideas. And then we invite them to a website where completely anonymously, they tell us specific stories of things that happened to them in the workplace that interfered with their ability to do their work. We don't say that made you feel excluded, because that's a very complicated thing that depends on your personal history, etc. Right?
Mental health. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we see is that sometimes we get like some of the biggest problems are really stupid things, like so many people complain that, hey, there was a meeting held in which decisions were made that impacted me, but I was not invited. And a lot of times it's because the manager holding that forgot to invite you, or because the manager and his buddies were out having lunch and they're like, oh, hey, let's make this decision. And they forgot that they were impacting other people. Now, when we measure that and we see it's a big problem, we go to a company and we say, fix this. It's very easy. Create a spreadsheet online that every manager has with a list of all the people that need to be invited to different meetings, and make sure that they check it every time. And if they don't, hold them accountable for it. And when you do that part, you're going to make that process better for everyone, including the introvert white male. Mm-hmm. But you're going to be most likely having a positive impact on women, a positive impact on people of color, and even more positive impact on Black women and intersectionality. And so what you're doing is you're implicitly benefiting the people that are the most impacted without having to say, oh, I'm going to do an initiative to go and make things really good for queer, Black, Latina women with disabilities. It's like, so I try to flip that around, and I talk about that in the talk. And I give a couple of examples of the kinds of horrible experiences that people share, which also make it visible to the leaders that normally are kind of like, they stick their hand in the sand. They're like, oh, I don't see exclusion. This kind of stuff doesn't happen in my company. So when we go to them and say, here's the kind of crap that has happened in your company. Here's not all these people aren't happy. Here's things that are happening to people that are horrible. In some cases, they're not horrible. They're just annoying, but they interfere with their ability to succeed. Do you want that to happen in your company? Do you want to lose money? Go right ahead. But we're giving you the data that you need, and then we're showing you how to link it to your financial outcomes. And then it's up to you whether you want to do it or not.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Brilliant. We're getting short on time, but I have to ask this question. In this environment, with so much being done to dismantle DEI initiatives, what do you say, not just to those who are on the side of power and authority, but what do you say to those losing jobs, the thousands losing jobs, losing monuments and history, and frankly, losing hope? What would you say to them? Do you see any promise?
Right now it's grim. I feel so. First of all, I mean, what I would say to the people that are losing jobs is my deepest, sorrow for what they're experiencing.
Agreed.
They're basically, they're almost like collateral from the point of view of the government sees it. They don't care. They're like, yeah, and it's almost like the pandemic, but instead of being a virus, it's a mental, political, societal virus. But it's devastating, and I feel absolutely terrible, especially because it's targeting specific groups of people that are the most vulnerable people in the country.
Yes.
One of the things that I try to encourage people to do who are trying to resist or turn tables, if you will, is to be mindful that doubling down and yelling louder while ignoring some of the mistakes that we've made is not going to be constructive. And I think that if I could say one mistake that has been made in general is that so much of the energy that was built up after the murder of George Floyd, unfortunately, was focused on making people's problems be seen. It was a lot more about, oh, now it's my turn to be recognized for all the stuff that's been happening to me. Too much of the focus has been on I don't want to say complaining, but about focusing on the problems that people have. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what's caused the backlash. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to encourage a lot of my colleagues in DI to say, take this as an opportunity to think about how you can refocus your work in a way that actually aligns with what they want. Instead of continue to tell them why they're doing things wrong and why they've done horrible things and they need to fix that, try to align yourself and ask yourself. So if you go around and your tendency to say, like I hear people that are like, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a really fair and equitable company where everybody has a chance to succeed? Well, a lot of people don't give a damn about that. Quite bluntly, if you're the CEO of a company, that's not part of your responsibilities to your board and your shareholders. But if you say, wouldn't it be wonderful if you have an equitable company where everybody has a chance to succeed so they can make more money for you? All of a sudden, you're like, oh, yeah. And if you can show me that, in fact, having a fair and equitable company that makes everybody happy makes me more money, I will absolutely listen to you. So I'm trying to really encourage people to get beyond the, oh, woe is me, all this horrible stuff is happening, and think about, what can I do? Think of it as a marketing problem.
Right.
I don't want
And
to make a bigger
solutions.
billboard telling you that you're dumb. I want to come up with a different kind of advertising that's going to convince you that this is in your best interest and not just in mine. So that's my one big message, is that let's start. We'll come back for part 2 as to why I think that there is a misunderstanding of why so much backlash. We'll
Right.
do that in part 2, but I do think that let's move forward. Let's not complain about what's happened. Let's not try to get louder about the same arguments that we love in our own echo chambers, but they sound very hollow to people outside that echo chamber. And let's try to understand, what are they saying in their echo chamber, and how can we get in on their conversation to convince them of what we want to convince them.
Right. And at the end of the day, the best communication is not just to be heard, but to understand and to be understood. And
Absolutely.
a new approach is definitely in order. This has just been fascinating. My head is spinning with all the new concepts and information. I'm so grateful that we had this opportunity to chat. Listeners, of course, will drop links to the book, TEDx Talk, his website. But Paolo, where can they find you online and learn more about your services?
Thank you. No, I would say, first of all, it's been a real pleasure. I love these kinds of conversations, and it's always an honor for me to be invited. But people can go to my company's website, which is Aleria, is the name of the company, Aleria, and then it's .tech, .tech, not .com. So
Gotcha.
Aleria.tech, easiest way to get a lot of information. We do a lot of both these measuring inclusion, but we also do a lot of not teaching really, but it's more like education about inclusive leadership, inclusive management. We do webinars, and we're getting a lot of demand for that right now. And then my book online, if you look for Measuring Inclusion, either at Amazon or any online bookseller, you'll find that. My TED Talk, there are not a lot of Paolo Gaudianos out there. So if you would search for me, I tend to pop up fairly regularly, whether it's LinkedIn or the TED website. I can be found pretty easily.
Sweet, sweet. Well, thank you again for sharing these insights and strategies. And I truly, truly wish you continued success in making the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. Like, subscribe, and share. Help us spread these good news, these tips, these strategies to enhance personal growth and professional success. Until next time, be well and be brave. Thank you.